Now, we know Sailor Moon isn't exactly adult material, but it's really good. Anime X was released in 1999 by Carnage, a British demo scene group originally formed as High Heaven back in 1988. The group's founder, Kay, was pretty much the only active member for a while, and started out releasing pack discs full of cracked games, but switched focus from crime to demo productions as the group expanded. They released a ton of anime stuff over the years, mostly slideshows full of rips from popular shows, manga, and even Japanese computer games. Look, they made an Irresponsible Captain Tyler disc. More people have got to watch that show for real, it rocks.
God has forsaken us!
There's a slideshow here called Girls of Manga, and at first I was a little shocked by the content. It was all Goku. All of it. Almost every slide. Goku. From Dragon Ball. Girls of Manga. All Goku. Original art too, and really well drawn at that. I was elated, but sadly, I think the wires must have been crossed somewhere. Maybe the place I downloaded it from had mislabeled it. Maybe I had accidentally changed the name, moving my files around. I don't know. But sadly, the real Girls of Manga disc is more or less exactly what you'd expect, though the quality of the art and rips was still top-notch, which wasn't always a guarantee. Look at how squished some of this stuff is. One of their gallery discs doubled as a sort of informational disc magazine. Anime V catalogued all the releases that were officially available in the UK at the time, and even provided contact info for the company selling them. Wish it wasn't so bloody hard to read though. Whose idea was it to have a background image with solid dark colours right next to this selection of font hues? Come on now, the Word never had this issue. Anime V was eventually followed by the far more comprehensive and legible Anime X, and it was the last release Carnage made for the Amiga before calling it quits. There just wasn't much life left in the scene by 1999, and, well, they had to move on with their lives eventually. This mag was a joint effort between group founder Kay and group member Bubblegum, formerly known as Amiga. Bubblegum was responsible for Anime V and sourced the images for most of the group's anime galleries, so my guess is that they were the resident turbo weeb. Every group has one. They're clearly knowledgeable and passionate about the subject matter, and the number of reviews they managed to pack into this single floppy disk is honestly staggering. 880 kilobytes is not a lot of space, even when it comes to text. The articles are all taken from the Erotic Anime Movie Guide by Helen McCarthy and Jonathan Clemens, which goes some way to explaining their professional quality relative to other disc mags on the scene. I had a blast going through them all. It was really interesting to see just how much of this stuff had already crossed the border, and how people in the fandom perceived it back then. I was still a kid in 1999, my main exposure to anime was Dragon Ball Z and mysterious ads in the back of gaming mags that had me wondering how a cartoon managed to get an 18 rating. That, and well, there was that time we got an Orotsuki Doji bootleg on VHS, but my dad quickly realized what kind of movie it was and shut it off. Did you know that Orotsuki Doji was voted one of the 50 best cartoons of all time by viewers of Channel 4 over here in the UK? I just thought that was neat. I really love how the mag is presented. The whole production really captures that slice-of-life anime adventure game vibe. I imagine this is what those games would have sounded like had the Amiga taken off in Japan. It does seem to have some fans over there though. Pour one out for the demo scene. The mag primarily sells itself as a guide to anime of a stress-relieving nature, and contains overviews for dozens of shows, movies, and OVAs, but as we've already seen, not all of the listed media is made for you to get your rocks off. Of the ones that are, the writers have a clear preference for those that marry their practical value with stories and characters that are worth engaging with on a deeper emotional or intellectual level. There's nothing wrong with art that's made to help you defeat your meat, to be clear. Sexuality is as much a part of most folks' inner lives as their politics or philosophy or whatever. And they don't seem to have any hang-ups about this stuff either. It's just that the most enthusiastic writing can be found in the reviews for the more story-driven entries, or in the way that they unload on shit that's particularly poor quality. This would have been an incredibly valuable resource at the time, much cheaper than the book it was taking from, unless your local library had it. And even today, it's definitely added to my list of stuff to check out. I love gross old anime. Pretty much the only stuff I give a shit about is nasty straight-to-video garbage. I've heard it said that your favorite era of anime isn't necessarily the one with all your favorites, but rather it's the one where you can even enjoy the trash, and man, the luxuriously animated exploitation film adjacent filth of the OVA period is exactly my kind of trash. In addition to the anime guide, there's also a brief history on the development of Japanese eroge. Eroge, for my less weeby friends, is the Japanese term for games designed with a certain utility in mind. It's pretty interesting, starting from the early Mahjong arcade games and moving on to the then modern adventure games and visual novels, which were just beginning to receive translations into English. This section ends with a prediction about the future of the industry, where anime-styled graphics mostly fall out of fashion as advancing computer hardware makes live-action footage more accessible to more users. This, of course, was dead wrong. Sexy anime shit absolutely dominates the adult game market in the 21st century, but they didn't think that anime eroge would vanish entirely, rather that it would become increasingly depraved and fantastical in order to justify its continued existence, shunning modern-day scenarios and vanilla sex for more outlandish settings and kinks. This was less wrong, but wrong nonetheless. I mean, I feel like a lot of 90s eroge was kinda already there. You ever play Uno, or Virgin Angel, or Night Slave? Not a fan of the non-con in Night Slave, but I am a fan of Erica. Look at that fucking bell! Anyway, Tokimeki Memorial is not an eroge, but it is discussed here regardless, translated quite untimishly as Heartbeat Memorial. The article gives a quick overview of how the systems work and what your ultimate goal is, and then offers a bit of critique of the game's core concept from a feminist perspective. It's not particularly harsh or condemning, it's merely pointing out that it's difficult to systemize dating in this way without being objectifying, despite the game's best efforts. This barely even feels like a criticism to me, but Tokimeki has started to occupy a really weird place in the English-speaking internet's collective consciousness recently, so this is sure to piss someone off. I almost didn't mention it. The mag did get on a very specific nerve of mine though. Why do weebs keep using the word Western when they mean North American or English speaking? Western gaming history is barely a thing. Each country had a distinct, largely separate market for basically the whole 80s and much of the 90s too. By 1999, there was definitely more global cohesion, but it was a long time coming, and the relative place of each major platform was radically different from country to country, even in the West. Prior to that, even countries that shared a language were isolated from each other. You weren't getting major American games like Ultima onto a cassette for the mainstream UK market, and the NES didn't catch on here till like 1990. Most of the popular home games and formats were domestic, and even the Commodore 64 had a different library in the UK versus the US because nobody could afford a floppy disk drive. Shit cost as much as the computer. We were making and playing completely different sorts of games. There was an entirely different culture with different design principles and market desires, and it led to a split in the types of games that were being produced that persisted even once we were getting more American stuff in the 16 and 32-bit eras. And while we're at it, the rest of Europe was not an extension of the UK. Each country had its own popular systems and made its own distinct games, many of which are artistically significant and unavailable in English. There's an unfortunate tendency in gaming to say European when we mean British, but it turns out that things were different in different countries. To say nothing of the obscure histories of, like, say Slovakia or Brazil, both often considered Western in gaming conversations, where domestic clones of popular consoles and computers had significant libraries of unique and cool-looking games. There's more to Brazil than just Tectoy, you know. Honestly, these books on screen right now, essential reading for anyone who gives the slightest shit about gaming history. But still, you see this bugbear crop up in the movie guide too. The Western credits are all UK and US, all English language, nothing to do with the other Western countries that had completely different relationships to the anime movement. Countries that already had their own weeb cultures which were totally distinct from ours. Differences that were reflected in their respective home computer scenes. Albion is a PD game released for the Atari ST in 1990. From a modern or American perspective, it's kind of an RPG adventure game hybrid, like Circuit's Edge or something, but this was relatively common for French games at the time, with shit like the Bat duology or Fer and Flamme. My French language skills are sub-fluent, but I was able to muddle my way through some of the game before it crashed on me 3 times. I had a lot of trouble figuring out what to do against the wild animals though. They always seemed to knock me back to a different part of the map anytime I tried to act, and I couldn't even walk away. Very frustrating. But despite that, there's something compelling about the game that makes me want to push through and see if there's more. I mean, it is a PD game, so it could just be busted or hate emulators, but I don't know. I think my language and gaming skills are what's preventing further progress, not its status as an amateur production. Now, if you're below a certain age or just not that much of a computer pervert, then the term PD might require a little explanation. PD stands for public domain, and while it mostly referred to software that was, in fact, in the public domain, it was colloquially used to refer to all kinds of amateur-produced, non-commercial software, including demo productions, much to the demo scene's consternation. There were a lot of PD companies out there putting out mail-order catalogs full of software that anyone could submit their shit to, and many of the big computer mags of the time had a small section where they'd review the most notable PD software of the month. There were even whole publications dedicated to this specific part of the computer scene. A lot of this software was also made available on bulletin board systems or online services like CompuNet. You can think of these as a kind of pre-internet internet. You'd use a modem and your telephone line to communicate with other computers, but it wasn't a global network like the internet, which remained inaccessible to most home users until the mid-90s or so, depending on where you lived. It's cool stuff, but the important part here is that these BBSs and PD catalogs were full of material made by enthusiasts who didn't feel bound by copyright law. Just tons of cool shit made up of ripped graphics and copyrighted audio. Albion is very much in this category, taking its art and its audio from several popular anime like Dirty Pair or Future Police Orochiman. I can't identify all of the sources here, but near as I can tell, the game doesn't contain any original graphics at all. I say that non-judgmentally, as a bitch whose first game stole all of its music from Final Fantasy, Sonic, and the Mod Archive. How little has changed. Contrary to the UK, France's favourite 16-bit computer prior to the PC was the Atari ST, and you can see the country's famous weebery all over its scene. There's a type of prod called a pack menu, where bunches of software is compressed as small as it'll go and squeezed onto a floppy disk for distribution, usually with a fancy menu screen in the typical scene style. Every other pack disk for the Atari ST is adorned with graphics ripped from anime that was popular in France. And there was a decent amount of fan and original art to go around too. You can even find this shit in the ST crack throws from time to time. This is a hell of a way to open up Ultima 4, I gotta say. Of course, the French scene did still contain a number of Amiga groups like Nihon Dreamers, a group whose entire reason for being was to spread the good word of Japanimation. And they released a ton of slideshows and demos starting as early as 1992, packed full of fan art for shows like Dragon Ball, Ranma 1/2 and Record of Lodoss War. They even tried to get fancy with some original animation in their demos, and the quality of the art is pretty decent. France's obsession with all things Japan goes back to the Japanism movement of the 19th century, when the forcible opening of Japan's trade borders by the Americans resulted in an outpouring of culture which impressed artists all across the West. But it was Grendizer, aired there as Goldorak on Channel A2 in 1978, which really burst a dam where anime is concerned. It was a sensation, by some accounts the most widely viewed show on television. It was beloved by kids nationwide, including Chief Dickhead Emmanuel Macron, and led to a sea change in France's approach to animation. 2 iconic Franco-Japanese co-productions, Ulysses 31 and The Mysterious Cities of Gold, emerged from its influence and would help to put the world-famous entertainment on the map, who you may know as the creators of Sonic Sat AM. The Mysterious Cities of Gold is another one of the shows that Albion ripped its graphics from as it happens. Cool stuff. Club Dorothée represented the next big moment in France's anime obsession. Airing in the late 80s, it was a children's variety show full of musical performances and comedy skits and shit, but it also aired a number of anime like Saint Seiya, Sailor Moon and Dragon Ball, original and Z, as part of its programming block. way before any of that shit was officially available in English. It was popular enough that there was even a DBZ game for the SNES which received a European localization long before most English speakers really knew what DBZ was. There were definitely anime perverts in the Anglosphere at this point in time for sure. Akira wasn't exactly obscure, but only freaks were really seeking this shit out, where kids all over the country were being exposed to shows like DBZ and Fist of the North Star in France without having to look for them.
Il me semble reconnaître cet enjôflu. Je ne sais pas qui est ce guignol. Cette technique vieille de 2000 ans ne s'acquiert que par le travail.
Which did, naturally, cause some problems with the moral guardians. Club Dorothee's cool anime shit was taken off the air and replaced by what one Nicolas Chauvet, speaking with The Guardian, calls disgusting French sitcoms with ridiculous teenagers having their first kiss. Christ. It was too late anyway. Anime, along with the forthcoming manga boom, would further strengthen France and Japan's cultural relationship, eventually turning France into the world's largest importer of manga, and leading to the emergence of manhwa, bande dessinée in the style of popular Japanese comics. France is, of course, far from the only European country to have a history of weebery that is quite separate from the Anglospheres. Over here in the UK, our early exposure to anime mostly came from companies like Manga Entertainment localizing ultra-violent gore and sex OVAs, which gave anime a reputation for puerile transgression that wasn't entirely fair. They really left money on the table not localizing Captain Tsubasa for the child market. That shit would have done gangbusters. But Spain, Italy, and Germany were all, like France, exposed to anime on mainstream broadcast TV to varying degrees of success. They were all dogged by moral panic to some extent, but again, just like in France, this did little to stem the rising tide of anime-manga fandom. Shows and movies like Grandizer, Lupin, 70s Devilman, and Astro Boy really cemented anime as an important part of Italian youth. Not that this stopped the Italian bad boys from branding Astro Boy a bullshit one, and wishing death upon those responsible for Astro Ganga. As expected of a demoscene zine in 1990, lame is probably the bad boys' favourite word. It's in every other fucking entry. A lot of the writing here comes off as young'uns in their mid to late teens performatively hating kids media because they're growing up now and want to be challenged, or at least see some gore and boobies. I wouldn't take it too seriously, these are the words of teenage boys from 34 years ago. Shit's ancient history now, and you tend to grow up a lot between the ages of 17 and 51. That said, there are some choice quotes here.
Dragon Ball! Comic
adventures about a guy and a bitch
against flame offenders. Dragon Ball, the ultimate quest. This one is only for kids and lamers. Dragon Ball, with pussy. Street Shaman wants to fuck Fujiko. Dragon Ball, to not see this anime is a great loss, like self-cutting an arm.
Self-cutting an arm.
Jesus Christ. The interface is a pain in the ass, but I really love the mag's whole presentation. It's the most magazine-like disc mag I've ever come across, with a ton of interesting layouts and just a lot of visual variety in general. The illustrations are all pretty good as well. These aren't digitizations or rips or anything, this is all original fan art by group member Street Shaman, and I gotta say, he did a top-notch job. What a wet pussy, my dude. You can see more of his art in the group's manga slideshow demo, and I am very impressed by both the volume of material and the fidelity to the source. This kind of shit is such an underappreciated part of computer history, to be honest. Motherfuckers weren't just gaming and doing taxes on these things, they were listening to music, they were watching animations, they were beating off to anime screenshots. All of this was available before you had the internet, or even hard drives in most computers. There was so much more than just gaming and work platforms. But gaming was an undeniably important part of the culture, and it's another area where them Italians really shined when it came to imitations of their Japanese idols. Fighting Spirit is the best fighting game on the Amiga. Now granted, it doesn't have a lot of competition. I'm excluding stuff like international karate just on the basis that it's kind of a different thing, and with that disclaimer in mind, fellow spaghetti gay Shadow Fighter is the only other viable candidate in my correct opinion. Like, just look at the competition. Elfmania and Body Blows are just kind of alright. Rise of the Robots is infamous. Taekwondo Master is very funny. Tube Warriors is baffling. The Art of Breaking Heads is better than you'd think, but limited by being an amateur freeware production. The Mortal Kombats have endless disc swapping, even if they're pretty impressive. And the Street Fighter ports kinda suck shit. Well, okay. The Arga Super Street Fighter 2 port is kinda okay, I guess. It's at least hovering around Mega Drive quality. But nobody ever talks about it because nobody fucking played it. And it's still worse than the SNES and PC Engine versions, despite being on broadly more capable hardware. And look, I know you Nintendo freaks are out there right now snickering about the Mega Drive ports, but it's kind of funny. I remember thinking that the slowdown in the Mega Drive ports was intentional, like it was slow motion trying to emphasize the weight of each attack. I thought the SNES ports sucked for lacking it. Anyway, these games all have their own problems, from disc swapping to crappy balance to swagless character designs, but the thing uniting most of them is their incredibly limited one-button control schemes. So, context. Most action games on the Amiga and Atari ST required the use of a joystick, and while options for 2 or more action buttons were not uncommon, the majority of games assumed that your joystick only had a single fire button. It's probably because in the mid-1980s, when these machines launched, most joysticks really did only have one button, and that's what the previous generation of computers supported too, so you could just keep using the same sticks that you had for your Commodore 64 until they broke. As a result, games were designed around a single button, and because they were designed around a single button, nobody felt any need to go out and buy the sticks that had more. Very circular problem, and it caused real issues heading into the 90s, when action games were primarily competing against shit on the Mega Drive and Super Nintendo. And the PC Engine to a lesser extent, despite it never officially releasing over here in Euroland. Kind of frustrating because the MSX was pretty popular in Europe too, and that had a 2-button joypad, so... Shadow Fighter holds up decently well despite this limitation. It's responsive, it feels weighty, and you never really feel like you're fighting against the controls too much. They designed it around the limitations of the joystick really smartly, and though its anime-inspired graphics don't necessarily look authentic, they land in a really satisfying place regardless. Most Amiga fighting games can't really match the quality of the character designs featured in their Japanese inspirations, but Shadow Fighter probably comes the closest. There are some odd 90s stereotypes, as you might imagine, though, and Manx here is clearly taking more than a little inspiration from Lum Verse Yatsurathane, but regardless, there's a lot to love. Fighting Spirit, though, just rocks. It doesn't have an original bone in its body, but it stands up against the era of fighting games it's drawing from amazingly well. Sadly, that era was about 3 years in the past at this point, but still, those games are fun and had considerably larger development teams than most European Amiga studios had. Lightshock Software also made the wise decision not to stay beholden to the dreaded one-button joystick. The CD32 was out, and not only did that bitch have a real controller, that controller was compatible with the Amiga computer line. So Fighting Spirit was, unlike its competitors, free to be a real fighting game with real tech and shit. Man, I'm no fighting game pervert really, but I think they nailed it. At first glance, it looks just like an old school SNK port. Sheila's jacket may not go with her outfit in the slightest, but the backgrounds are beautiful, the animation is top notch, it sounds crunchy, and man, the music. I fucking love the cheesy opening tune. Take a listen. The singer sounds like he's trying not to get yelled at by his parents, but it's just so extra. I love it. Good as Fighting Spirit is, though, it's not Lightshock Software's masterpiece. That would be Black Viper, a vehicle combat game with a 7-minute introduction sequence that rips some shots straight out of Fist of the North Star. War has ravaged the surface, leaving much of the planet an uninhabitable radioactive wasteland while cruel gangs rule the highways which connect the cities. The gangs are funded by the Redamin, a shadowy organization responsible for the apocalyptic war which has devastated the Earth. You are Efren Kadan, son of Ben Kadan, and you have joined a small band of rebels in an effort to liberate the highways and the world with the help of your father's bike, the Black Viper. According to graphic artist Marco Genovesi, the only way to convince coder Emanuele Viola to work on another game after the traumatic experience of making Nathan Never was to develop something drawing from his favourite anime and shit. Obviously there are other influences here, like Mad Max is blatantly apparent, and apparently Blade Runner? And you can see a good bit of metal influence too. A good number of the song titles are taken outright from popular bands of the time like Cradle of Filth and At the Gates. The game itself is basically the Shadow the Hedgehog of super handguns, kind of a Mac Rider or Road Blasters like, but I like it a great deal more than either of those games. It has its faults, for sure. It's super easy to break your expensive ass weaponry. There are no saves, lives, or continues, and you can only heal between levels by spending money on repairs at the shop, so it's a fucking nightmare to actually try and beat the fucking thing. But what it has over those other games, in my opinion, is vibes. A game's atmosphere is incredibly important to me, and Black Viper's particular combination of grungy orange visuals and fist-clenched eyes to the horizon tunes gives it this really strong emotional texture. You make your way across the wasteland by choosing from a variety of crisscrossing highways that make up each of the game's levels. Each level is given a short description to set the mood, and the portentous writing and music do a lot to infuse the game with a sense of grandiosity and narrative. Context matters. It changes how you engage with a game and its world, and even though Black Viper doesn't have that much going on in terms of traditional cinematic storytelling, what's here really sets a tone, really gives purpose to the gameplay. It manages to feel like an epic post-apocalyptic journey just through its presentation and a few small snippets of text. The punishing game design ultimately assists in this feeling even, limping across the finish line not knowing if you'll have the funds to survive the next leg of the journey is thrilling, and it really adds a sense of desperation that permeates the rest of the game. Even the death screen is dramatic, detailing the terrible fate that befalls the world as a result of your failure, set to an incredible painted backdrop and pensive piano piece. Honestly, this is probably one of my favourite games of the entire 16-bit generation. Sadly, it came out a bit too late to really impress anyone at the time, but in the modern day where every game from 1996 feels archaic, it no longer matters. You're not buying it in lieu of Tomb Raider in 2024, you know? It's basically fucking free. Lightshark Software don't care. I guess what I'm saying is, Black Viper rules, and the haters can eat my shit. Lightshock weren't the only Euro devs pulling from Japanese shit for inspiration, of course. There were a number of European countries where the Japanese consoles took a while to really catch on, but Japanese games dominated the arcades worldwide. Later, both the Mega Drive and Super Nintendo would bring Japanese consoles to the forefront, largely supplanting home computers in the mainstream over here. Domestic developers decided to try the designs exemplified by the JP games of the time, and with this ludic influence firmly in place, it was only natural that they'd take some visual influence from anime and manga as well. There was even at least one officially licensed game based on Akira, which is, well, bad, but original games like the Turrican series, developed by Germany's Rainbow Arts, are rightfully iconic. Turrican's lead platform was actually the Commodore 64, but naturally it's the Amiga ports by Factor 5 that I'm most familiar with. It has some charmingly skunk anime cutscenes that I just adore, with character designs that are ripped straight out of Gundam or Legend of the Galactic Heroes or something. And the music by Chris Hulsbeck is incredible, combining the best of Japanese and European VGM styles into something which is instantly identifiable as Turrican. Despite the slightly ropey cutscene graphics, they really give competing console games a run for their money. I'm something of an iconoclast, so my personal favourite is Turrican 3, a significantly consoleized game which actually started life on the Mega Drive as Mega Turrican, but fan consensus is that 2 is the real masterpiece of the series. 1 and 2 are definitely much more computer gamey, with much less linear levels and a brutal difficulty curve worsened by a lack of knockback or invincibility when hit, but they're much more approachable to a console gamer than most computer platformers would be, I think. They're just good good games, very responsive and satisfying with large but intuitive levels, cool power-ups, and some great shmup sections, drawing more from Japanese arcades than from the Euro shmup genre. Now, I love me a good Euro shmup. Disposable Heroes? Rips. Looks great, sounds amazing, and I actually find the shops add a compelling rhythm to the gameplay. But I understand that my preferences are not universal and that Euro shmups have a bit of a reputation, especially amongst Americans. Well, to people of such tastes, may I present Amiga, a shmup from the Gradius school of design with a story straight out of a cheesy, cheerful OVA. It's another German game, and the anime art is, again, a little wonky, but the game in general looks absolutely incredible and features another amazing Chris Hulsbeck score. A bunch of my friends, including my lovely girlfriend who made this video possible, really fuck with this game. You see, I have a bit of a problem. It's too fucking hard! It's one of those shmups where death sends you back to a checkpoint and you lose all your power-ups, so you may as well just fucking give up. Fuck you. Die. Catch me rapping Gun BF99 instead. Now there's an Amiga shmup you can trust. What the fuck is Twin B? I keep coming back to it though, it's hard to stay mad at Amiga. It just looks, sounds and feels too good to play, the level design is tight and the co-op works really well. And the music and atmosphere are just spot on, but it's just so punishing. The problem is me, I know, it's a skill issue. Maybe I'm just too computer game brained for this sort of thing. Much more my speed are the RPGs, like the Shadowlands and Shadow Worlds duology by British developer Tech London and publisher Domark. They have pretty unique control systems where each of your limbs correspond to a different command. From the player's perspective, the left arm is for attacks or item use, the right arm is for interacting with things in the environment, the right leg is for moving, and the left leg is for moving the whole squad at once, and the head is for eating and reading. I don't recall there being anybody to talk to though. Both games utilize a pseudo-real-time combat system similar to stuff like Legend or Darklands or Baldur's Gate, and they even have a neat real-time lighting system that's used for puzzle design and shit. It's great. Seeing monsters stalking you from just outside the boundary of light can be a real sphincter-tightening experience sometimes. There are some interface issues. The screen doesn't scroll until your character reaches the edge, at which point the whole game freezes while the camera catches up. And anytime you pick up an item, your character will stash whatever they were holding already to replace it with whatever trash you just grabbed. But despite these issues, I've always found this game really engrossing. It has the same appeal as first-person dungeon crawlers like Dungeon Master and Eye of the Beholder for me. It's very light on narrative, but it really understands the appeal of dungeon fantasy. It's not just locking you in a maze filled with combat, it wants you to use your brain to solve puzzles and overcome traps, and its flexible character control system really gives you a ton of room for creative problem solving and combat tactics. It's the sort of game where it pays to stack the deck in your favour before getting into a fight. I just really love the sort of RPG where exploration is just as gameplay rich as the combat is, where the dungeon itself is the challenge and not just the monsters inside. Honestly, this feels like a spiritual predecessor to Icewind Dale. It's great. I ran into a bit of a snag when I was grabbing footage though. For some reason my priest character instantly died. Like, the second the game started, that bitch was in the dirt. He must have been murked by this fucking bird, probably had like a single hit point or some shit. Whilst the RPGs of this sort were also being developed in Japan for Japanese computers, it's definitely not the sort of game you think of when someone says JRPG, which tracks. British gamers had very limited exposure to Japanese console RPGs at the time, even compared with the US. The only real manga or anime influence in Shadowlands is the customizable character portraits. Shadow Worlds had preset characters, each with their own little bios, and some of these designs are really cool. Jade, my beloved. But that's still about where the influence ends. I don't know, it has a bit of a horror atmosphere. I'm just gonna chat shit and say it was inspired by Hell Target. The game design more closely resembles the American school of RPGs than anything would usually associate with Britain during this time period. Its unconventional control scheme and isometric perspective, not yet common in America but standard in Britain, does betray its roots somewhat. Folks making British RPGs in the 8-bit era would have had limited direct exposure to games like Ultima, Wizardry or Fantasy. Nobody really cared about the genre until Dungeon Master, and even then it was really more of an exception to the rule in a rising tide lifts all ships situation. so homegrown games often came out really weird, whether out of ignorance of convention or just an attempt to make the genre more attractive to domestic audiences. And it can make them really difficult to understand if you're coming to them from American or Japanese RPGs, or even RPGs from elsewhere in Europe, all of which share a lot of fundamentals even if they go in different directions with them. Actually, there's a funny CRPG Addict post where he wonders if the British just deliberately avoid copying Americans even when their ideas are good. And this was in a post about Heimdall, which honestly feels a lot more conventional to me than a lot of other BRPGs. Only the French seem to baffle him as much as we do. Good blog, like it a lot. Tech London and Domark weren't the only British devs to jump on the anime hype train in the early 90s. Traveller's Tales, the folks what may call them Lego games, made an Amiga action platformer called Leander, whose visuals are clearly taking inspiration from the anime movement's emerging popularity. Leander's pretty good, it moves nice and looks great and has a real sense of adventure, but it hits a real pet peeve of mine, which is that it forces you to choose between sound effects and music. It's just not the sort of game that really works without music in my opinion, but losing the sound effects is kinesthetically ruinous. The game is still worth checking out, but when it comes to Amiga action platformers, I can't in good conscience recommend it over something like Lionheart. I mean, look at those fucking backgrounds! Also, maybe check out Mr. Nuts Hoppin' Mad. It's completely different to the console Mr. Nuts. This bitch has an entire Zelda overworld with a dungeon synth track playing the whole time. It rocks. As far as I can tell, nobody produced anything like an adult anime visual novel or adventure game, which is actually quite surprising to me, as there's something that already existed in Europe independent of any anime influence. Let It Click is an adult Italian game in a style that we would today define as a kinetic visual novel, but it's from all the way back in 1987, way before that term existed. Though it isn't exactly erotic, Passengers of the Wind is a French kinetic VN from fucking 1986. You also had first-person erotic adventure games like Fascination, which would certainly be on the less narrative end of the eroge industry in Japan, but it remains a fundamentally similar thing. There's just a ton of this stuff, you know? Hell, even America got in on it. Not only did you have Infocom's Infocomics, which weren't adult but were visual novels, and the Brad Stallion series, which, God, you had Bar Games in 1990, which has a full-on horny dating sim mode. Now this is sexism. Quite a few of the adult games on the Amiga and ST were closer to what the Erotic Anime Movie Guide predicted the future would be: digitized photographs of models in various states of undress. Toon fuckers were really being left out in the cold when it came to games. Obviously, there was a shit ton of hentai on the gallery discs. Even the safe for work stuff I've shown throughout this video came from discs that had at least a couple of lewd images in them, and there were plenty of discs that were produced for the express purpose of increasing your spirit. It's not like the scene wasn't aware of eroge. There was a lot of original art on these gallery discs for sure, and a lot of rips from erotic anime and manga, but some of it definitely seems to have been ripped directly from eroge released exclusively on Japanese computers. It's not as though anime-style European eroge doesn't exist at all, but it's mostly plotless puzzle games, nothing like the more elaborate story-driven erotica and smut of games like Fascination, or the enormous industry of adult games in Japan. I wouldn't expect the high production values of the biggest eroge studios. Even mainstream games didn't get funding like that in Europe. It's just kind of shocking that I never found anything in that style at all, even in the PD scene. It seems that, despite the extant, albeit small, adult adventure game industry on home computers in Europe, there just wasn't the same appetite for sexy anime women in games here that there was in Japan. Or was there? For you see, there was a secret third computer haunting Europe during the 1990s. Besides the PC, and not the Acorn Archimedes, not even the twin liches of the 8-bit era, I'm talking about the MSX. The machine that gave the world Metal Gear. The European MSX scene is fascinating and has direct ties to the scenes in Korea, Brazil, and Japan. It's best known now for being where the first Japanese to English and Japanese to Spanish video game fan translations happen, but it's an incredibly vibrant and creative scene responsible for tons of incredible games and productions that have been all but forgotten by the wider gaming world. Dutch group Sunrise even produced their own hardware for the MSX, including a graphics card that allowed it to match the SNES, and a sound card that put it within striking distance of the fucking PS1. This shit was absolutely incredible, but also deserving of its own video. Next time, my friends. Truth be told, I'm something of a lapsed weeb. I haven't really been into anime in like 12 years, or whenever it was that Nichijou came out. There are still some shows I like here and there. I loved Odd Taxi, and I had a wonderful time watching Little Witch Academia with Lydia, who I also love. But for the most part, anime is much more a part of teenage Sarah than it is 30-something Sarah, you know? But who we were forms the foundation for who we are. Anime held such mystique for me as a kid, or at least the stuff I couldn't watch did. The stuff on TV, Dragon Ball Z, Pokemon, Gundam Wing, that was all just cartoons to me. But seeing those VHS ads in magazines or wandering over to the nasties section of the video shop and seeing this wild and edgy cartoon shit really lit my imagination on fire. How bad could a cartoon be? It felt dangerous and mysterious, almost more so than the extreme horror movies that surrounded it. Surely a cartoon had to be really fucked up to get an 18 rating. Sometime in 2002 or 2003, whenever it became possible to do so, a friend and I torrented Kite after asking Jeeves for the most fucked up anime, and good god did it feel like it delivered. I was mortified, but I was also hooked. I was a weeb now, and I needed more. I craved blood. I started killing people, and